Just go start. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Marina Picciotto. I'm a professor of psychiatry, neuroscience, and pharmacology at Yale University, and I'm here to interview myself about the intersection between neuroscience and public policy around addiction. I chaired a symposium yesterday with Dr. Elizabeth Howell from the University of Utah and Dr. Joseph Cheer from the University of Maryland. And each of us chose an area of drug addiction where we see that policy is really changing quickly. So my area of research is around nicotine and its receptors in the brain, and I collaborate with my colleagues who do both human lab studies as well as clinical imaging studies and treatment studies around how you can use the neuroscience of addiction and of nicotine action to develop new treatments and to understand treatments for smoking cessation and now for vaping cessation. My colleague Joe Cheer works on the fundamental neuroscience of how cannabinoids, so the primary psychoactive component of marijuana, works in the brain. And he does basic science studies on cannabis and also now has been translating those to new treatments, not only for cannabis users, but in fact using cannabinoids to treat other addictions, but also other psychiatric illness, and particularly pain and emotional distress from neurodegenerative disorders such as Huntington's and Parkinson's disease. And finally, my colleague Beth Howell is one of the primary providers of addiction treatment to an enormous population of addicts in the southern United States. She's based in Utah. Her talk was primarily on opiates, but she also spoke quite a bit about how behind every opiate epidemic in the history of the US has come really quickly an epidemic of psychostimulant use. So right now in her area it's methamphetamine, but there's also concerns about cocaine and other stimulants. And what we talked about was that in each of the cases, and particularly for nicotine, cannabinoids, and opiates, we have receptors in our brain for substances, endogenous substances that we use to signal normally through those receptors. So we have endogenous cannabinoids, endogenous opiates, and we have acetylcholine, which signals through the nicotine receptors. And in each case, when we take the drug, we're either mimicking or disrupting the action of these normally functioning systems. And we showed that we can do human imaging studies on all of these compounds and show where those receptors are in the brain and the body. We can show how there's competition for those receptors with the smoked or injected drugs. And we talked about how we can understand more about why we become addicted based on what we understand about the neuroscience of each of these systems. And so where the intersection with public policy comes is in particular about, first of all, education. We know that it is not inherently a terrible thing to take any of these substances. Not inherently a terrible thing to have nicotine acting in an adult brain, cannabinoids acting in an adult brain, and certainly it is a very good thing to have the therapeutic actions of opiates in our hands as a clinical tool. And the problem comes when laws change very rapidly and there isn't policy informed by the neuroscience. So just to recap, one of the main themes was the difference between what happens to adolescents and developing kids who are exposed to each of these substances versus adults. We know that the developing brain is normally making its connections with respect to what's happening in the real environment. Right? So matching our brain function to what actually happens to us is super important. And now when we have any of these substances on board as those connections are forming, now we don't have a great match between experience and behavior. And when you're developing, then in fact, you have a critical period where these changes can take place. You can certainly change your brain as an adult, but the boundaries of that change are now limited by what experience you had as a developing child or adolescent. So for cannabinoids, Dr. Cheer published a beautiful set of rodent studies showing how different the brain's reward systems are when you are giving the cannabinoids during pregnancy. So that has huge implications for policy. What do we do when we have women who are pregnant who are coming to their doctors for nausea, for pain, and who are using cannabinoids either because they are medically available or legal for even recreational use, because the perception is that it's much safer than many other medications, other ways to deal with that nausea. What do we have to do? We have to do studies. We actually have to provide evidence, number one, that the cannabinoids do help with the symptoms that are being treated. Does it really help with nausea versus other treatments? Does it really alleviate pain in ways or help with sleep in ways that other treatments, whether it be non-pharmacological like meditation, therapies that can actually engage behaviorally, or whether there be other pharmacological agents. So we need evidence, right? We need the scientific evidence. And Dr. Cheer's studies suggest that there are going to be unintended consequences of greater and greater use of those cannabis products particularly during pregnancy. The presentation that I made was around a similar set of studies, also in rodents, but also in teenagers, human teenagers who were either smokers during teenagehood or who were exposed to smoking in utero or both, showing that in both humans and in mice, we see changes in attention that way outlast the original exposure to nicotine, well, to tobacco in humans and to nicotine in mice. And what we saw was that those changes were actually mediated by molecular genetic changes that are characterizable in the mouse that we can then go back and forth to the human and test. But the missing piece there is that we don't know whether the human tobacco studies are due to only the nicotine in tobacco. So now that vaping is occurring, there are many, many more constituents in vape liquid than are disclosed. And there are many fewer studies of the consequence of vaping long-term on the prenatal and teenage brain than there are of smoking. So the call from my session was for more research on what is the effect of those nicotine products alone, what is the effect of vaping, and in particular, and I think this is the most important, the request for policymakers to require full disclosure of all of the constituents of vape liquids, the same way that when you go to the supermarket and you get a box of Oreos, you know everything that's in those Oreos. We aren't even taking Oreos into our lungs. We should know what's coming into our lungs. And then finally, Dr. Howell, from her incredible experience with patients with addiction, really pointed to the importance of neuroscience research, both animal and human, to the treatments that she does have in hand. So in particular, really only for tobacco, alcohol, and opiates, we have pharmacological medications. For all of the addictions, we have a really good wealth of behavioral treatments that have been validated based on experience and outcomes, but also with respect to what changes occur in behavior in the brain. But we're really missing treatments, particularly for methamphetamine and other psychostimulants. We don't have pharmacological treatments that work or that are FDA approved. We need more tools, and we need to know what the commonalities and differences in the addictive process is for humans who are abusing opiates versus amphetamine, methamphetamine, nicotine, cannabinoids, and alcohol. So that's really a recap of the session, and I don't know if any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask. Really, this is meant to be a give and take, so if there are things that you'd like to bring up, I can re-announce the question, and then I'm happy to answer anything that you're thinking about. Anyone? Are any of you from states where cannabis and marijuana products are now legal for either recreational use or for medical use? Sort of, yeah, part way. Have any of you noticed the enormous change in basically walking down the street, seeing vape shops where there really were none? And For me, the biggest change was, because I was very primed for it, was seeing the big change in the number of shops that advertise nicotine vape pens and mass-produced products that are delivering nicotine now in new ways. And I actually first heard about the big jump in adolescent nicotine vaping from my daughter. She's now 19, but when she was about 15, she said, "Mom, have you heard about this thing? It's called Juul." I said, "No." And this is my job. That was really bad. And it turns out the biggest change that she noticed was the fact that Juul could be concealed inside your hand. It is about the size of a thumb drive. And so the kids in her class found it hysterical that they could vape during class. And if the teacher came and looked at them, they'd say, "What? It's just my thumb drive. It's just my USB." That was the initial attraction. But there's some really interesting things about vaping and about cigarettes that tell us about drug delivery, and that may in fact be applicable to changing the ways we treat illnesses with products that are getting to the brains. The one thing that I learned a long time ago is that the combustible cigarette is a really effective drug delivery device. Number one, nicotine actually it's very sticky. It usually sticks to your skin and it gets absorbed across the skin. And if any of you have a medical or a biology background, you know that anything absorbed across your skin gets down to your liver first, gets broken down by liver enzymes where all sorts of toxicants get broken down normally, and then blood levels are lower, goes back to the heart, goes up to the brain. That's really slow. It lets low levels of nicotine get to your brain. And that's why patch is not abused. Nicotine patches are used for smoking cessation and now for vaping cessation. But nobody goes, "Oh, I need that patch. I've got to get another patch on now." And that's because of this drug delivery. What happens with smoked nicotine is that the particles in the smoke actually get coated with the nicotine, and when you inhale, it gets deeper into the lungs, down into the alveoli, and there it diffuses across into the bloodstream that goes straight to the brain. And so you get a big peak of nicotine. It's cleared very rapidly. We know from basic biophysics studies that what that does to the nicotine receptors is that it opens them all together at once. And so then there's the one big wave of opening of these receptors, and you get a big increase in the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine that I think most of you have heard of, was Time Magazine's Molecule of the Year one year. And dopamine is at the heart of all of the substances that humans are addicted to. There are many things that we abuse, but the compulsion of addiction at its heart converges on dopamine. It's not the only thing, but it's at the heart. And so that drug delivery is why smoking cigarettes is very good at getting people to have a repetitive behavior. That lighting of the cigarette, looking at the pack, is associated with that rush of dopamine, and then it begins a cycle of behavior. Turns out that the early vape devices were not really very well designed to get your nicotine to your brain. They were not high power enough. The amount of nicotine in the vape fluid was lower, and most of the absorption, again, came in the mouth. Over time, what happened is that each vape device had a stronger element. That element delivered more steam, but also the concentration of nicotine in the fluid went up. And here's the other thing, particularly in Juul, the form of nicotine was changed. And the type of salt of nicotine that is in Juul appears to be absorbed a little bit better in the lungs. It appears to get to the lungs. So now we don't have the tar, which is the particle that gets the nicotine into the lungs in cigarettes, but we do have more of the nicotine getting into the airways deeper and deeper. And here's another thing, that some of the later generations of vape pens came with a USB that you could plug into your computer, measures your topology, that means measures how strongly you inhale, and then you hit, "Did you like it?" So basically, the device allowed you to tune your own nicotine delivery and to actually increase the delivery that was getting to your brain. And those vape pens, which became fourth and fifth generation vape pens are now being used really compulsively. So it differs. Not all of us, and this was another theme of the panel, not all of us are going to get addicted. Our environment, our genes vary a lot, and all of those things, coupled with exposure, are what get us to the point of addiction. And so if you have the susceptibility and you get exposed to any of these drugs, then you may be the one who progresses to compulsive use, where it's the person next to you who does the same thing, samples it, and then leaves it alone. And so there are teenagers now that are vaping pretty much continuously. And when you get nicotine into the brain at those levels, what happens is that you overwhelm the system. And we know that one of the things that is true in rodents, and it's certainly true in humans, is that if you get enough nicotine into your brain, that you can cause seizures. So there now have been isolated reports of extremely heavy nicotine vape use, mostly in teenagers, leading to serious seizures. Yeah. Yeah, and I'll repeat the question. Right. Exactly. Terrific. I'm going to repeat that question. So the point was made that we get these cycles of, wow, this new substance is a thing that's going to cure all of these things, whether it's cannabidiol or vaped nicotine versus smoked nicotine, decreasing lung cancer, or opiates for chronic pain, where they don't work as well as for acute pain, versus epidemics. And that we get this cycle of public health boon and then public health crisis, and it's communicated as first, here, this is going to solve everything, and then it's a crisis. And the question is, what do we do as scientists? How do we communicate? And it is really difficult. And I actually walk this line quite a bit all the time, because none of these substances, as I mentioned, is either. Neither is a panacea, neither are they going to destroy life as we know it. And the consequence of this kind of dialogue is that policy is made in reaction to the public concerns rather than to what is known. So let me take each of them in turn. So one of the things that we know about smoked nicotine is that it leads to lung cancer, stroke, and heart disease. And it took decades for the community to acknowledge that public health crisis and then to come up with ways to address that. And one of the tools that is among many to help people switch from smoking to less harmful behaviors has been, in fact, vaping. And so in some communities, vaping is considered an amazing tool in smoking cessation. And then as we get concerned about youth exposure and youth vaping, other communities have banned it entirely. The key is to try to actually communicate the subtleties, that it is important to know what is in vape liquid. It's important to keep kids from thinking this is super safe, so we should use it because, it's not going to do anything to our brains. And it's important to make it as a tool available to adults who want to stop smoking, all at the same time. And there are a few ways you can do that if you know about the science. One is that you can actually ban flavors that are meant only to appeal to completely naive users, like cotton candy, caramel apple. I've heard the cotton candy flavor referred to as crack cocaine wrapped in a Malomar. This is not what we need for a dependent smoker to switch. My colleagues at Yale have done studies on flavors, and if you have tobacco flavor, experienced tobacco smokers don't mind it. Kids hate it. It's disgusting and gross. So why not allow any tobacco-flavored vape product to be out there? It makes it clear that this is something that's useful for experienced users, and it makes it much less attractive to kids who are really trying it out and who do enjoy those fruit flavors and candy flavors paired with the nicotine. With respect to cannabis, one of the things that my colleague really pointed out is it's a lot easier in states where recreational marijuana has become decriminalized and legal to use it as a recreational user than to study it. Research on these compounds is extremely difficult. So if you want to do a cannabis study in humans, or if you want to use cannabis as a probe in humans, as a researcher, it is extremely difficult. You have to have a Schedule I license, and you have to get the product from one farm. I believe he said it was in Kentucky. Mississippi, thank you. Thank you for the correction. That's exactly what I need. And the problem with that one farm is that it doesn't reflect the evolution of the products that are being used recreationally, the degree of, the level of cannabinoids in the products that are now more available. It's much higher than it used to be. And so you're not even using the same kinds of products that recreational users are using. That's wrong. It should never be more difficult to do studies and to get the data and to figure out what actually are the consequences of using the products than it is to use them casually. So those kinds of things were pointed out. And then with respect to opiates, there was a really long discussion about the consequences of policy where clinicians who have not gotten much time on addiction and pain therapy in their medical school coursework, there's some small portion of the curriculum devoted to this, are now having patients come in on a regular basis and talk to them about pain and talk to them about their addiction. And they don't necessarily have the tools to help those patients or to understand the kinds of policies that are being handed down. So for example, with the concern that everyone is becoming an addicted opiate user, acute pain is probably getting now undertreated again. And the real issue is that if you don't understand how opiates are effective for pain, then you may prescribe it for pain where it is not effective. In particular, chronic neuropathic pain is not particularly sensitive to opiates. And using opiates chronically for that kind of pain actually tends to sensitize the pain system, increasing the responses to that untreated pain over time rather than really treating it. So it's really, again, an issue of communicating not only to the public who are pushing against the crisis that they see of their kids potentially overdosing from this really dangerous availability, in particular, of prescription opiates, and clinicians who need to know what the science is, what the real effects of these opiates are, and how to prescribe them safely. So that question is exactly on point, and that's exactly what we wanted to emphasize in this panel. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Great. Yeah. So the question was about labeling and the fact that we don't know what's in vape liquid, we don't know what's in cannabis products and so on, but we have a model. So in Canada, where the entire country has actually changed their marijuana laws, all cannabis products are labeled and all constituents are fully disclosed. It's part of the law. So part of the issue of having a dichotomy between new regulations on a local level and then no real leadership or regulation on the federal level is that we can't do this kind of general policy decision to say, okay, if we're going to make cannabis available, we're going to label it and we're going to show you what's in it. For vape liquids, I think that is actually something that is within the current purview of the FDA. The FDA has already been given legislative authority to regulate tobacco products. There have been many legal battles around how to eliminate or ban certain constituents. For example, menthol, which allows youth users to use more and which makes it more difficult to quit, particularly targeting African American populations, has briefly been proposed to be banned, and then after pushback and lawsuits has not been banned. So those are difficult, but labeling should not be difficult. There shouldn't really be a way to have a lawsuit saying, I'm sorry, you cannot disclose what kinds of things are in these commercial vape liquids. So I think that's something that could be pushed for, and that could be a relatively quick legislative battle, although probably would still be a battle because everything is. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, so there was first a comment that in Canada where cannabis is legal, you can actually even register for your favorite component so that you can find out whether that's in the products that you use. But the part of the question that I think is really pertinent is the fact that people who are driving under the influence of cannabis may in fact be impaired drivers, and we don't know how to test for acute cannabis on board. Cannabinoids are lipids, they're fats, so they stay in your system for a long time. You may detect cannabinoids a month or more after you have taken in a cannabis product. So how can someone who is looking at an impaired driver actually determine whether someone's impaired because of the cannabis or some other reason? And let's go back to, so this is relevant because now with alcohol you can get blood levels, you can do breathalyzers, and you can ask how much of that alcohol is on board right now. But we didn't always have that problem, right? We didn't always measure alcohol content in real time. In the 1950s, everybody was pulled over if they were a dangerous driver, and they were asked to walk on a straight line and demonstrate their motor coordination. Touch your finger to your nose. Now do it with the other hand. There is no reason that we have to have an objective measure of whether cannabinoids are currently impairing your driving or not. We should just measure on whether your driving is impaired. If you see someone pulled over and they cannot walk a straight line, they should not be allowed to get back in their car, and that's something that is fair whether or not your impairment is because of a pharmacological substance or sleep deprivation or some other condition that makes you dangerous to yourself and other drivers on the road. So I think that it's interesting that this idea that, well, we can't tell if the person is acutely on cannabis and that's a problem. Really what we should be measuring is the practical outcome. Is someone driving unsafely? Then they should not be in a car. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming to this session. It was really a pleasure to talk with you today. I'm happy to answer questions afterward.